Hi, Year 10. This is going to be a 15-minute lesson on checking out my history by John Agard. I'm going to run through 5 different elements. So, context, content, language and methods, structure and form, and personal response. First of all, I'm just going to play you the poem. I'm going to play the version where Agard himself reads it because it links to the theme, and the theme is identity.
Them tell me what they want to tell me. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to me own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and Cat. But to St. Louis, what you know, them never tell me about that. Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick back, Napoleon, battalion, and first black republic born. Toussaint, the thorn to the French. Toussaint, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me the dish run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the maroon. Nanny, seafar woman of mountain dream, fire woman, struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shagga the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. From Jamaica, she traveled far. To the Crimean War, she volunteered to go, even when the British said no. She braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. Them tell me what they want to tell me. But now, I checking out my own history. I carving out my identity.
So, John Agard there performing his poem, and I think it's really important that you hear the poem because it's part of the oral tradition in both senses, oral to do with sound, but also oral to do with storytelling and the idea that people's identity is passed on through the traditions and the stories that they are told. So, Agard was born in Guyana in 1949 and he moved to Britain in 1977. His poetry tends to focus on identity and social observation and sometimes contains humour. Now, this poem was partially inspired by something that he read in a history book, and the line went something like this: West Indian history begins in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus. And the line kind of struck Agard because it suggests that nothing existed prior to Columbus's arrival, and the idea that it was the European who made this discovery, or the white man who made this discovery. Now, Agard began thinking about how history tends to be very Eurocentric, as if nothing existed until the European or the white man entered the arena. It made him think about how the retelling of history depends on who's telling the story. So one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. So it got me thinking about these questions. Do you feel like your curriculum is diverse? Who has made the decision about what you should and shouldn't study? Because it isn't your teachers, it's your government, and somebody somewhere makes a decision. These are the things you need to know, and these are the things that are kind of left out or marginalised. So Agard is challenging us to look beyond what we are simply told in the education system, and to actually seek out further information and to diversify our knowledge and to realise that actually there is not just one simple version of history. In terms of content, the poem obviously focuses on ideas about identity, racial identity and history. It's really important to recognise that Agard intentionally uses phonetic spelling to kind of celebrate his heritage and his culture. He uses the Creole language and dialect to show pride in his own identity and pride in his own history. The poet starts off with a focus on them, who is the them that he is referring to? What are they telling him? What do they want him to know? And he feels like he's been intentionally blinded. He uses the metaphor about being blinded to his own identity because he's getting this very narrow view of history. Now, until I read this poem, I didn't know who Mary Seacole was. I hadn't heard of Mary Seacole. So when you do your research and you find out that actually Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole both took on the same role as nurses, people who braved wars to help those suffering, you do have to question, why does history celebrate one and ignore another? Why is history predominantly marginalising certain groups of people? And maybe it's time that changed. And Agard is certainly presenting the idea that we need to move beyond just this one version of history. The poem has a real mixture of language, features, and methods. It has a sense of frustration and anger in his voice. The start of the poem is confrontational, and it creates this division, them versus us. And he feels like he has been blinded. So he uses this metaphor to do with injury: bandage up my eyes with my own history, blind me to my own identity. Now, you have some irony in there because the bandage should be something that heals. But in this sense, the bandage is something that has taken away his vision and taken away his opportunity to know about his own history and his own identity. As the poem progresses, he uses a mixture of language to celebrate his own identity. So he purposefully mixes figures from white European history and also figures from Black history. He uses a sing-song style in places which you could say is mocking some of these characters. Like, why does he need to learn about the dish that ran away with the spoon? Why does he need to know about the man who invented the balloon? This history feels irrelevant to him. And what he's saying is he hasn't been taught about these really significant, iconic Black figures. So Nanny de Maroon, Mary Seacole, and Tucson. And what he is trying to say is not that one version of history is more important than another, but that actually we need to know about all of these characters. We need to know about all of these figures, and that there needs to be that representation. Agard seems to move from his kind of sing-song nursery rhyme mocking tone to a style that shows respect and dignity. So when he talks about Tucson, a slave with vision, and a beacon, he uses that word beacon as a symbol of light. Nanny, seafire woman, of mountain dream, fire woman, again, imagery and symbolism associated with light. And it's kind of very spiritual in the way that he presents these characters. Again, Mary Seacole, the metaphor that she was a yellow sunrise to the dying. It's language that shows respect to these figures that have been ignored by mainstream history. Agard repeats the phrase, "dem tell me," because he's trying to show his anger at the idea that he's only seen one version of history. And we know that anger comes through in this poem, but the end of the poem is actually really positive and really uplifting. He says, I checking out my own history, I carving out my identity. Now, the verb to carve implies that he intends to do something active. There is a commitment to discovering his own identity, and that by doing that, it will validate his existence, to know his heritage. And this is something that we all need to do. We all need to have this broad, wider awareness of history, so that we can learn from the past and move forward and fully understand our identity. Structurally, the poem rejects sort of your standard version of what you would expect. It intentionally rejects any kind of formal structure. It's free verse. There is an irregular rhyme that runs through. The enjambment helps to show his frustration in what he's feeling. So them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus. It's this ongoing line that shows his ongoing frustration. You also have the rejection of punctuation and the rejection of standard English. Again, a part of the way that Agard presents his message is that he's not going to conform to these ways. He's going to respect and appreciate his own cultural heritage. In addition, the rhyme scheme helps to bring together the black and the white figures. So he talks about the man who discovers the balloon, the cow who jump over the moon, and Nanny de Maroon. So he mixes the figures together to end this segregation and to show that we need to give importance to all different types of people from across the world and respect the impact that these people have had. And it is the idea of breaking away from this Eurocentric view. The poem is free verse and it is part of the oral tradition. It's a poem that needs to be spoken and it is a poem that needs to be heard. And it's, again, a part of the way that Agard is showing pride in his identity and pride in his cultural heritage. It's the importance of storytelling, and we learn from the stories that we're told, and we learn from history and from these experiences. And it's the importance of passing on knowledge and passing on power. Ultimately, I feel the structure of this poem is showing Agard's refusal to conform to the rules of English language. He's standing against what he finds quite oppressive and dominant and controlling over him. So he's standing against this Eurocentric way of identity, which has isolated Black people. So he rejects standard English, he rejects punctuation, he uses the phonetic spelling to show pride in his culture and in his ethnicity. And it's important that we hear all different voices in society and that we learn from all areas of the world and not just from one very narrow view, one very narrow version of events. And finally, I feel like it's really important to give your own personal response to a poem. I feel like this poem now is really relevant with what's going on in the world. Obviously, the death of George Floyd and the protesting that's been going on globally, all people, all backgrounds coming together, protest against this injustice. So I feel like the poem kind of taps into that idea about identity and trying to give a voice to people who have been marginalised, trying to give a voice to people who have been isolated by the mainstream portrayals. So I've just put some links up here that you can maybe look at. I've put up the link to the Edward Colston statue, the idea of how we view history. You know, this man's been celebrated for his charitable work and the money that he's donated to the city of Bristol, money made off the back of the slave trade, a controversial statue which has just been pushed over the edge by what's happened. And obviously that statue was ripped down and thrown into the waters. It was a real moment of anger against that statue. And it's the idea of history. Who are we celebrating and why are we celebrating them? Do we need to look at the wider context? Do we need to look back and think about what we need to learn from history? And the Black curriculum, it was on the news today, the idea that too many schools are not looking at Black history and that it should be part of the curriculum. If we want equality in society, we need to learn about Black history to make sure that people have that understanding. And I've just put up a couple of pictures just to finish off a couple of things that I found quite thought-provoking recently. So saying all lives matter is like interrupting Martin Luther King to tell him about your dream from last night. Obviously, all lives matter, but at the moment, we need to deal with the fact that we have all of this racism, this institutionalized racism, and it needs to be challenged. I hope you found this presentation informative and a bit of revision really for the poem. I've included a couple of links. I'll attach the slideshow with the video. So there's a video of Agard talking about the poem and a Mr. Bruff tutorial. Plus there are a couple of additional slides with some additional information. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.